real quick. There we go. What we're going to talk about today is kind of how regulations and laws have changed in the digital age, right? How laws and regulations specifically related to digital media have come about and what they've kind of found, what they've kind of um, you know tried to do with regulating digital media, because it's a very different world, right? The internet is a very different creature than film and television and radio and print, right? And it begins with the Telecommunications Act in 1996. And the Telecommunications Act in 1996 is one of the worst pieces of legislation that, that has ever come across as it relates to the media industry and it relates to the business of media in the United States. Um, sorry, I gotta sneeze. And I say that because of the really incredibly crippling and damaging effect that it had on the industry of media in the United States after it was passed. Right, what the Telecommunications Act of 1996 was on its face, it was set out to create what we call universal service. Right, so think about our kind of history that we've done, our timelines that we've done. 1996, the internet is becoming more and more popular. More and more people are having access to the internet in their homes. Cable television is very, very prominent, and you have phone lines that are sharing both, your voice lines, your regular voice phone, and then that's also how you connect to the internet, right? So, phone service and cable television service were different companies, right? For most of their history. You had your ComEd or excuse me, you had uh, uh, your Bell companies for your phone service, right? So, like Jesus, I don't even remember the phone company for our area anymore. But you had AT&T and you had those companies, and all they did was provide the phone service. Then you had to contract with Comcast or Charter or one of these other companies to get your television service. Well, the Telecommunications Act in 1996, its stated goal was to allow these companies to work together and to make sure that everyone has access to them, right? So on the surface, cool, right? Like let's streamline services, let's make them more efficient, but also let's make sure that everybody can get access to cable television and everybody can get access to internet services, right? That was the stated goal of the act in 1996. But as is so often the case, the intent and the application don't always line up, right? And what ended up happening is that the Telecommunications Act allowed for these ideas of bundle packages, right? Because again, if the goal here is giving as many people access and by allowing, kind of companies to work together to streamline services, the idea of the bundle comes out, right? And that's the idea where you still today, right? You can get Comcast for phone and for internet and for television, right? In fact, they give pretty heavy discounts if you sign up for two or more of their services at the same time, right? I can very clearly remember when I still lived in Freeport, getting a call from Comcast, and I had internet and I had television, and they were trying to sell me on phone service, right? They wanted me to become a triple play, right? Have the phone service on there as well. And because of the packages they had, because of the bundles they had, I actually would have saved $12 a month by adding phone service, right? Can you turn that down, please, sweetheart? Thank you, honey. So, it not only allowed for bundle packages, but it was highly financially incentivized, right? Which sure does still sounds like a winner, still sounds like a great thing. But the way to accomplish these things was by expanding a single entity's ownership potential within a certain market, right? Prior to the Telecommunications Act of 1996, you were very restricted on how much media you could own within any particular market, right? So Rockford, for example, Rockford is what we call a small market. Of the, I think there's 170 unique media markets in the United States. Rockford's right near the bottom, right? It's one of the smallest markets in the country. Because it was a small market, you could only own one radio station in Rockford, right? Or one television station in Rockford. Well, after the Telecommunications Act in 1996, you could now own multiple television stations within the same market. You could now own multiple radio stations within the same market. You could own multiple television stations, radio stations, and newspapers within the same market. It made it easier for markets to be dominated by one company, right? And you see the effects of that still today, right? Even in Rockford. Cumulus Broadcasting owns, I think, 60% of the radio stations in Rockford. That's one company. One company owns 60% of the airwaves in Rockford, right? And television, WTVO, which is an ABC affiliate, and WQRF, which is a Fox affiliate. They're both owned by Nexstar, right? The same one company. Two television stations run out of the exact same studio. Well, what does that do? What does that create? What creates a tremendous loss of jobs, right? And I mentioned this before in class. If I own 5 radio stations, I don't need 5 buildings. I don't need 5 engineers. I don't need 5 drive time DJs. I don't need, right? I can significantly reduce the number of employees I need to operate my stations. When ownership was limited, every station needed its own staff. So those jobs all just kind of evaporated, right? They just got lost into the ether. There's also the issue that, again, we've discussed before, that when you decrease the number of sources, the number of places generating content, you tend to get a lot of echo chamber effect. You tend to get a lot of duplication. You don't get a lot of critical thought applied to that media. So it's not only bad for people who want to work in media, but it's also bad for the community, right? It also creates problems for a community. Another thing that the Telecommunications Act did is that it ended cable rate regulation. Believe it or not, there was a time in this country's history, in fact, a long time in this country's history, where there were guidelines in place, right? Not laws, but FCC guidelines in place that said a cable television company could not charge more than, X number of dollars for their services. The rates were regulated. And the Telecommunications Act ended that practice and said, all right, you can charge whatever you want and the market will decide, right? Which, look, I get the whole free market will decide. That's a legitimate philosophical, it's a legitimate political philosophy. It's a legitimate view of things, right? And it absolutely has legitimacy and credibility to it. But in the cable television industry, you don't have the competition factors that allow the free market to make those determinations. Right? Again, we've talked about this. If you live in Freeport and you want cable television, you only have one choice. You only have one option there. And if Comcast decides that, okay, we're going to charge $200 for this package, it's not like any other service you get where you can go, you know what? No, I'm going to go with your competitor because they're cheaper. Right? If you want cable television, you're stuck with their rates. Oh, well, I can get Dish or I can get DirecTV. Sure, but it's not the same product. The reliability of Dish, the reliability of DirecTV, not to mention, you can't get a signal for satellite everywhere. The house I owned in Freeport, I had DirecTV and Dish out at least once a year to try and direct me on, like, okay, what trees do I need to cut down? What things do I need to move? Because I didn't have a clear view of the right part of the sky to get a satellite signal on my property. I was completely at the mercy of Comcast if I wanted to watch cable television, if I wanted to watch these channels. The rates are only checked by competition. And when you don't have viable competition, you don't have any check on the rates. Again, same goes for internet. Same goes for high-speed internet. If you want high-speed internet in Freeport, you're working with Xfinity. That's it. You can get non-high-speed internet, but it's just not the same, right? You can't stream high definition, God forbid, 4K video using satellite internet or using cellular internet. It just doesn't work. So when the Telecommunications Act comes out in 1996, it doesn't get a lot of fanfare. It's not this highly debated, like people were up in arms. Oh my God, how are they going to do this? It really kind of just went completely under the radar because who gives a shit, right? Nobody cares. Nobody watches this kind of stuff. It's not a sexy story, right? It was just another piece of legislation. That was it. But the people in the industry are going to be digging themselves out from under this for years and years and years and years and years, right? This is going to have long-lasting impacts. It already has had severe impacts, and it's going to keep going. Here's a fun little trivia piece for you. In Freeport, Illinois, right, if you get the high-speed cable internet package from Xfinity, you're paying about 60, 65 bucks a month, right? And that 60, 65 bucks a month gets you pretty solid speed, right? It gives you pretty solid bandwidth. In Paris, France, the exact same speed of internet, the exact same bandwidth in Paris gets you to the exact same internet, gets the exact same service. It is $20 a month. Why? Why in the hell is it more expensive to access the internet in Freeport, Illinois than in Paris, France? It's the same thing, right? But I pay more because I'm here. And it's not a Freeport thing, right? Same goes for Rockford. Same goes for Chicago, right? The rates are 3 to 4 times higher in the United States than they are in France and Germany and England for the same service. And part of the reason is the Telecommunications Act of 1996. Because in France and Germany and England and a lot of other countries, they have competition, right? In France and England and Germany, the law is that you're not paying Comcast for the cable that runs into your house, the physical cable that runs in your house. You're paying Comcast for their service of what goes inside that, of just the data. But in the United States, no, Comcast owns that cable, the physical cable that goes inside your house. Okay, so, this has a direct impact on you and me. It has a direct impact on you and me because we're consumers of media, but it also has a direct impact on a lot of those, on anybody who wants to go into working in media, because the job market is significantly smaller than it was before. What are some of the other regulations that the government has tried to place on digital media, on internet in specific? One was called the Communications Decency Act of 1996, right? The CDA. And the Communications Decency Act of 1996 was an act of Congress, right? It was legislation that was written by Congress and signed by the president that attempted to regulate obscenity on the internet. Right. So obviously, as you all know, right, this must have worked because there is no obscenity on the internet. It's impossible to find obscene things on the internet, right? See, it's a joke. It's funny. Obviously, it didn't work. Obviously, it did not work. And it was blocked by the Supreme Court in 1997. The Supreme Court ruled that that was blatantly unconstitutional, that Just because you don't want children and younger folk to see things doesn't mean you have to block it from everybody, right? So Congress said, okay, fine. We learned our lesson. We'll try something else. And in 1998, they came up with the Child Online Protection Act, right? Or COPA. Okay. And the Child Online Protection Act was very similar to the Communications Decency Act, right? And in fact, you'll see this a lot in legislation and government modes where if the court strikes down something, the court will give its reasoning, right? The court will say, well, this is unconstitutional because of X, Y, and Z. And so legislators will then, write the law again, but they'll change the X, Y, Z part that made it unconstitutional, try and get it through, through again. So in 1998, Congress approved the Child Online Protection Act, which, again, its goal was to try and force internet providers to block access to obscene materials from children, right? Which, okay, sure, noble goal. I think people can agree that, sure, we should try and do that. But the problem is, you can't do that in this country. We have free speech and we have free access to things. And the risk of somebody who's not supposed to see it seeing it doesn't outweigh the rights of people who do want to see it. And so in 2002, the Supreme Court blocked the Child Online Protection Act. So again, I hope you're seeing a theme here, right? That good intentions don't make good laws necessarily. And again, like I said, at the very beginning of this section, we passed the First Amendment. We ratify the First Amendment that says Congress, shall not abridge a person's freedom of speech, freedom of press, blah, blah, blah. And then immediately after, we start challenging that and saying, okay, but here are some times when you can stop somebody's speech or stop somebody's press. We have a long history. We have a tradition almost in this country of struggling with the idea of whether or not we like free speech in practice or we like free speech in theory. And these laws are another example of that. They're another application of this, right? See, the baby doesn't like it either. He's also disapproves. One of the biggest struggles that we find when it comes to laws in the 21st century for media is what we call intellectual property rights, right? I think most people are pretty familiar with the idea of a copyright. If I write a book, right, that's my work, right? And I should get credit for my work. If I invent a new mousetrap, that's my work. I should get credit for that work. Well, the same also holds true for non-things, right? Just as a patent, right, says that this design is my design, you also have rights to things that you just thought up first, right? Concepts that you came up with first, or art that you created, right? You have rights to those things. And in the digital age, protecting those rights and protecting those, your legitimate ownership of those things is becoming more and more difficult, right? Because it's so easy to spread them and it's so easy to illegally transfer them. In 1998, Congress approved the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or DMCA, which still stands today. And the Digital Millennium Copyright Act is a law that protects copyrights online, right? That says this is what allows film companies and record companies to sue 13-year-old kids in Kansas for, file sharing a movie or file sharing an album. Right. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act is what makes it illegal to share digital content without the creator's permission. And again, it's still in effect today. It still is the law as of right now. Um, Fun story. When my son started figuring out how to like illegally stream movies, how to torrent, right? He figured out how to torrent, but he didn't figure out how to use a VPN, how to use a virtual protection network. So I was getting all these weird emails from my cable provider telling me about these violations of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act traced back to my IP address, right? And if I didn't stop doing this, that they were gonna cancel my service and blah 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 blah. I was like, what the fuck? So I saved them. I still have these emails, right, from Charter, uh, accusing somebody in my household of violating the DMCA. Because I thought it was funny. I was like, yeah, I talk about this in my class. And now my son is breaking that law. That's cool. Right. So the Digital Millennium Copyright Act was our first attempt to protect a creator's property rights, essentially, in the digital world. In 2001, the Supreme Court gets involved in the case of New York Times versus Ticini. New York Times versus Ticini was about an author who is what we call a freelancer, right? Um, Ticini was a writer, but he wasn't employed by the New York Times. He was self-employed. And what a freelancer does is they'll write their story in this case, and then they'll try to sell it to the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, right? So they don't work for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. They work for themselves, and then they just sell that individual piece to whatever newspaper wants it, right? So Ticini is a freelancer, and he writes a story that gets paid for, gets bought by the New York Times, right? They decide they want to run that story. They pay him for the exclusive rights to it. But around the same time, 2001, is when you start seeing a lot more news databases starting to be popular, right? One in particular is called LexisNexis, right? At Highland, we use EBSCOhost, right? And these are just news databases where if you're doing research, right, and you want to find good, legitimate research, not just some schmuck on the internet. If you want to find legitimate research about, trash cans, right, you go to LexisNexis or you go to EBSCOhost and you look for articles about trash cans, right? And it only brings back the results from credible news sites, credible newspapers, credible magazines, blah, 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 blah. Well, the way that the contracts always worked for freelancers was that you get paid for the story to run in the newspaper that one time, right? So if I write a story about the geese of Highland Community College and the Journal Standard, wants to run that story, then they would be paying me for the rights to run that story one time. Well, now with news databases and everything, once that story runs in the New York Times or runs in the Journal Standard, it's now in this news database for forever. And the New York Times or the Journal Standard or whoever is constantly getting use, right? They're constantly getting that association of my article with their paper. So Ticini was arguing that that's not fair, right? That I created it, it's still my property. And just like royalties for any other intellectual property, I should be getting royalties and I should maintain ownership, even though you paid me to run it in your newspaper that one time. Because again, that's all you paid me for, was the one-time usage. Supreme Court ultimately sided with Ticini and said, yeah, you do still have that ownership. You do still have that right. Just because somebody paid you to use it once doesn't mean you no longer are the author, doesn't mean you are no longer responsible for the creation of that thing. In 2005, the Supreme Court heard the case of MGM versus Grokster. Now, MGM is one of the large film studios, right? One of the big film studios in the country. And in 2005, they went before the Supreme Court suing Grokster. And Grokster was the heir apparent to Napster, right? Napster was the file sharing peer-to-peer service where, you know, you could access the files of anybody else who was signed on at the same time as you. And this allowed for the illegal but easy transmission of movies and albums and all that kind of stuff. So Napster got shut down, remember, in 2001. Well, in 2005, Grokster had become very, very popular in its place, had replaced it, and MGM took them to court to say, hey, they're doing what they shouldn't. They're doing what was already determined to be bad in the Napster situation, but we're going to go a step further. And the ultimate finding of MGM versus Grokster is that the Supreme Court ruled that not only was Grokster in the wrong for allowing file sharing, but that they were liable for the way people were using their software. The court argued in their findings that Grokster was just as responsible as the users for this illegal file sharing because they created software that they knew would be used for illegal purposes. And so, for the first time ever, the Supreme Court of the United States in 2005 ruled that the creator of a product is just as responsible as the user of that product when it's used illegally. And now I phrased it that way on purpose because I want you to think of how you could possibly apply that to literally anything else. If I buy a Chevy Tahoe and I use that Chevy Tahoe to mow down and murder 13 people, could the family members of those people, those victims, sue Chevy and say, well, he used your product to do it and you knew, look at that, it's a giant vehicle. You think people wouldn't kill somebody with that thing? You think people wouldn't use that as a weapon? That case would never make it to court. That case would never even remotely get to a courtroom. It would be laughed out before they could even file any motions. But that's exactly what happened in MGM versus Grokster. Only when it comes to intellectual property rights, that is the only aspect, the only avenue, the only format in the United States wherein you can sue the creator of the device for how people used it. It made big news a few years ago when the Attorney General of West Virginia and Oklahoma sued pharmaceutical companies because they found compelling evidence that these pharmaceutical companies knew that their products were being abused, their opiate products were being abused, but kept selling and distributing those products in Oklahoma and West Virginia. In other words, they were arguing that these pharmaceutical companies were enabling drug addicts in Oklahoma and West Virginia. And again, this was big news. This is a big deal because this was government entities trying to hold pharmaceutical companies accountable for how people were using their products. That's the closest we've come to recreating the finding of MGM versus Grokster. And again, those cases weren't successful, right? They weren't successful. So it's bizarre to me. It will never stop being bizarre to me how we've given a privileged position to intellectual property rights in the Supreme Court. It's kind of bizarre to me in some ways, in a lot of ways, honestly. One of the biggest issues that we face today, and are probably going to be facing for a long time, is something called net neutrality. If you haven't heard of net neutrality, then you have not read anything for the last 3 years. Um, net neutrality kind of revolves around this question: should internet service providers be allowed to block or throttle down access to lawful content? Should Comcast, should Spectrum, should AT&T, should they be allowed to slow down my service if they don't like the websites I'm going to? Should they be allowed to just block access to websites, period? This is the challenge of net neutrality. If I'm paying Spectrum, in my case, $65 a month for access to the internet, don't I have the right to do whatever I want with the internet? Because I've paid them for access to it. Opponents of net neutrality say, well, no. Because if you pay for admissions to Great America, you don't get to do whatever the hell you want once you're in there. You don't get to do whatever you want, go wherever you want. There are still restrictions placed upon you. You paid for access, but there are things within there that you still have to follow rules. Proponents of net neutrality, on the other hand, say, well, that's not the same fucking thing. Because Great America is exclusive, right? I'm paying for access to physical property. I'm paying for access to physical space, things that they've created. Great America owns the roller coasters. But on the internet, Spectrum doesn't own the websites I'm looking at. They don't own the content I'm accessing. All they do is allow me to get to it. Proponents of net neutrality would say that the analogy is more accurate to say it's the equivalent of the government blocking off exits on the highway and saying, you know what, yeah, we don't want you going that way. We don't want you going to this business. So even though, even though you're paying for access to this roadway, we don't want you to use this particular off ramp. Because our taxes pay for the roads. It's taxpayers who are paying for these services. Doesn't that grant me access to everything that's on the highway? Don't I have rights to use that highway? So net neutrality is a much more controversial issue than I think a lot of people realize. Right? In 2010, the FCC proposed rules to protect net neutrality. So in 2010, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, proposed rules that would protect net neutrality, that would not allow Comcast, Spectrum, AT&T, Verizon, whoever, to restrict access to the internet. Right? If I'm paying you for internet access, that's it. Whether I'm going to YouTube or I'm going to bobsgardensupply.com, it doesn't affect how my service works, right? Because I'm paying for access to the whole damn internet, and how I use it is my business. So in 2010, the FCC proposed those rules, and those rules took effect in 2011. In 2011, those rules were approved, and net neutrality was the standard. That's the way it was operating, is that you, as a internet service provider, as an ISP, were not allowed to throttle down, slow down, or block access to lawful content. Well, and 2017 came around, and the new commissioners on the FCC decided, no, that's not necessary. And they repealed net neutrality. And that is where it stands today. And that is where it stands right now. If you have Xfinity Internet, right? If Xfinity is your internet provider and Comcast as a company decides that they're going to try to buy YouTube, right? But that deal doesn't go through, right? YouTube is not for sale. They're not able to work it out. Comcast fails at their attempt to purchase YouTube. The way that the regulations are as of right now, Comcast could then dramatically reduce the speeds at which Comcast internet users are able to access YouTube. They could force all Comcast users to have just a miserable experience accessing YouTube. And they're allowed to do that. They're completely allowed to do that under the current regulations, right? Again, there are people who think good, that's the way it should be. And there are people who think, no, that's horrific, that's terrible. I have very strong opinions, but they're my opinions. So I'll let you guys try to make up your own minds. If you care, not that you will. One of the biggest trends I hope you're noticing when it comes to regulating digital media is that it ain't easy, right? It is not easy. There are a lot of issues that come up once we try to regulate digital media, right? One of those common problems is issues of jurisdiction. If I commit a crime in Rockford, Illinois, I can be arrested by the Rockford, Illinois Police Department. I can be arrested by the Winnebago County Sheriff. I can be arrested by the Illinois State Police. I can be arrested by the FBI. I cannot be arrested by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. I cannot be arrested by the British Secret Service. They don't have jurisdiction. If I commit a crime in Rockford, Illinois, the Freeport police can't touch me. They don't have jurisdiction. They do not have power in that area, in that geographical location. Well, this becomes incredibly important and difficult when we're dealing with the internet. Because where is the internet? Where's the headquarters of the internet? So who has jurisdiction? I'll give you a hint. Not the United States. The United States does not have jurisdiction over the internet. The United States has jurisdiction over businesses that operate in the United States. So if I run an internet company out of the United States, they have jurisdiction over my company, but they don't have jurisdiction over the internet, right? Users from the Netherlands don't have to abide by American laws on the internet because they're not subject to American laws. They're only subject to the laws of their country. One of the biggest problems is that technology moves at a much faster rate than legislation. The way that laws work, right, the logistical way that laws happen is someone has to write them. They have to be approved by a committee in the House or the Senate. It then goes to the full membership of the House or the Senate to be voted on there. Then it goes to the other body of Congress. So if it starts in the House, then it goes to the Senate. If it starts in the Senate, then it goes to the House. It has to be approved by that second house. And then it needs to be signed by the president. That's a lot of steps and a lot of people involved, which means it takes a lot of time, right? It takes a lot of time to move from a thought to a signed piece of legislation. It takes even more time when there's some kind of controversy or disagreement about the issue at hand. Right? It takes a long ass. If I wanted to write a law that said hot dogs are good, right? Even that is going to take a couple weeks at best to get through both houses of Congress and the president's desk. But if I want to write a law about something that's controversial or something that not everyone agrees on, or that some people have deep moral, philosophical qualms with, like censorship, like First Amendment issues, oh, you better believe that's going to take a long time to get done. Technology, on the other hand, changes in the blink of an eye. And so by the time a law gets approved, gets signed and passed, the technology it was looking to regulate has already moved past it. It's already moved beyond what that law was trying to accomplish, was trying to regulate. The last problem is that regulations are not written by technologically inclined people. And as younger people, you have all, I have no doubt, experienced this firsthand. If you've ever tried to help your grandma or your grandpa or even your parents when they have a tech issue, right? When your grandma or your grandpa or your parents say, like, oh, I can't figure out this thing on my phone. And you get frustrated beyond belief because no matter how you explain it or what you say, they just don't get it. And they can't figure out the most basic shit. This is what happens when it comes to regulating digital media in the United States. Look at the makeup of the people who write the laws. We're not dealing with tech-savvy, tech-native young people. We're dealing with 80-year-old farts. And they're the ones writing the laws. You know, a couple months ago, the CEO of Google was testifying before the Senate subcommittee, right? And the questions he was getting were some of the dumbest fucking questions you could possibly ask the CEO of Google. One of them asked him about pop-up ads he was getting on his iPhone. And the CEO of Google had to explain to a senator in the United States that he had nothing to do with pop-up ads on an iPhone. How in the hell are you going to have good laws written by people who don't know what they're talking about? They don't know how to use technology. They don't understand technology. How are they going to write good laws about it? My favorite example of this is many years old now, but never ever gets old. And this is a quote by Ted Stevens. Now, Ted Stevens was a senator from Alaska. He's that really ugly son of a bitch in the corner there. Ted Stevens was a senator from Alaska, but not just a senator from Alaska. He was also the chair of the Senate committee that oversees internet regulations and internet activity. In other words, Ted Stevens was the most powerful man in the country when it came to matters of internet regulation. And when asked about net neutrality, this is a direct quote from Ted Stevens. 10 movies streaming across that internet. And what happens to your own personal internet? I just the other day got an internet was sent by my staff at 10 o'clock in the morning on Friday. I got it yesterday, Tuesday. Why? Because it got tangled up with all these things going on the internet commercially. They want to deliver vast amounts of information over the internet. And again, the internet is not something that you just dump something on. It's not a big truck. It's a series of tubes. And if you don't understand, those tubes can be filled. And if they're filled, when you put your message in, it gets in line and it's going to be delayed by anyone who puts into that tube enormous amounts of material. Look, I don't think you need to be an electrical engineer. I don't think you need to be a software developer. I don't think you need to be much smarter than a 10-year-old to realize that's fucking dumb. That isn't even remotely accurate in describing anything having to do with the internet. And there it is. There's the guy who was in charge of laws and regulations regarding internet content. If that doesn't sum up perfectly why we cannot have nice things, I don't know what will. All right. Well, like I said, we're no longer doing Fridays because why bother? So we will not have class again until Monday. In the meanwhile, behave yourselves. If you have not yet called dibs on one of the cases for your media law analysis paper, do that ASAP. Get on that pronto, so we can get to working on that. On Monday, we're going to talk more about that paper. We're going to go over more detail on that. So don't want to miss that one. It's going to be a real barn burner, let me tell you. And otherwise, have a good one, kids. And I will see y'all later.